It started without warning. One moment, the entire galaxy was humming along as usual, ships jumping between star systems, data flowing through quantum relays, diplomats from 100 different worlds arguing over trade tariffs and mining rights. The next moment, silence. Not the quiet kind of silence you get on a calm night, but the kind that hits like a wall, sudden, total, and deeply unsettling. Earth had gone dark. No one saw it coming. Not really. Sure, there had been whispers, a few tense meetings, some complaints from human representatives about unfair labor practices or the way off-world births were monitored. But those were just background noise in the grand machinery of the Galactic Concord. After all, humanity had only joined the Alliance a little over a century ago. They were still the new kids on the block, brilliant, stubborn, and full of ideas, but not exactly a major power player. Or so everyone thought. Then came the message. It wasn't dramatic. No threats, no grand speeches. Just a single transmission, broadcast from Geneva Orbital Command, routed through every official channel the Concorde used to speak with Earth. The words were short, clear and final. Effective immediately, the unified Terran government terminates all diplomatic, economic, and communicative relations with the Galactic Concord. This decision is non-negotiable. Do not attempt contact. And just like that, every human outpost, every colony ship, every research station from Mars to Proxima Centauri B went radio silent. Comms shut down. Navigation beacons powered off. Trade routes froze mid-transit. Human freighters that had been en route to alien markets simply turned around and headed home, or vanished into uncharted space. No explanations. No goodbyes. On Xylos Prime, the capital world of the Concord, the Galaxy Council chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates from species that had never raised their voices in centuries were now shouting over each other, their translators struggling to keep up. Some demanded immediate action. Others insisted it was a bluff. A few just sat in stunned silence, their multicolored eyes wide with disbelief. How could an entire species, billions of people across dozens of worlds, just disappear? The truth was, no one understood. Not fully. The Concord had always assumed humanity would keep playing by the rules. After all, they benefited from the Alliance. Human engineers helped design faster warp drives. Human doctors developed nanotech that cured diseases across the galaxy. Human artists, musicians, even chefs. Earth's culture had become quietly woven into the fabric of interstellar life. To cut all ties wasn't just shocking. It felt like a betrayal. But from Earth's point of view, it wasn't betrayal. It was survival. Back on the home planet, the decision hadn't come from a single leader or a secret cabal. It came from something far more powerful, a shared feeling. For years, people had watched as their children born on distant colonies were required to undergo genetic screening by alien authorities. They'd seen entire asteroid mining crews, mostly human, work 18-hour shifts in brutal conditions, paid in credits that barely covered the cost of oxygen. They'd heard stories of human scientists being denied access to their own research because it violated Concorde bioethics protocols, written by beings who didn't even breathe oxygen. At first, it was just frustration, then anger, then resolve. The final straw wasn't one big event, it was 1,000 small ones. A viral video showing a human worker collapsing from exhaustion on a Glisa mining platform. A leaked report proving that Earth's clean water tech was being sold to wealthy alien worlds, while human settlements on Titan struggled with rationing. A quiet but growing sense that no matter how much they contributed, humanity would always be second-class citizens in someone else's galaxy. So when the vote came, across continents, across political divides, across old rivalries that had once nearly torn the planet apart, something rare happened. Everyone agreed. Not because they wanted war, not because they hated aliens, but because they finally wanted to be in control of their own future. The moment the order went out, Earth changed. Not with explosions or fanfare, but with quiet determination. In orbital shipyards, technicians began disconnecting alien-made power couplings and rewiring systems with homegrown tech. On Mars, farmers switched from Concord-approved crop strains back to old Earth seeds, stored in vaults for emergencies. In cities from Mumbai to Buenos Aires, people gathered in squares not to protest but to listen, to the silence where alien voices used to be. And that silence? It was louder than any alarm. Meanwhile, across the stars, panic spread. The conquered depended on human innovation more than anyone wanted to admit. Half the terraforming projects on newly settled worlds used algorithms written by human programmers. Medical drones in 3 different sectors ran on Earth-designed AI. Even the conquered's own translation network relied on linguistic models trained on human languages. Now all of it was frozen. Updates stopped. Licenses expired. Systems began to glitch. Some species accused humanity of sabotage. Others whispered that Earth had been planning this for years, that the whole alliance was just a cover while humans built their own hidden fleet. But the truth was far simpler. Earth wasn't attacking. It was retreating. Drawing a line in the cosmic sand and saying, "This far and no further," the Galaxy Council scrambled to respond. Emergency envoys were dispatched. Messages were sent through every back channel imaginable. Some pleaded, some threatened. One even tried sending a gift, a rare crystal from the heart of a dying star meant as a peace offering. It arrived at the edge of the Sol system and was gently redirected back with a single line. "We appreciate the gesture. Please respect our decision." No one on Earth celebrated. There was no victory parade, just a deep collective breath, and the heavy weight of knowing they'd just stepped off the map of the known galaxy. They were alone now, truly alone, no backup, no allies. Just 10 billion people, one fragile planet, and whatever they could build with their own hands. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like theirs. Back on Xylos Prime, the Council finally called an emergency recess. The chamber emptied, leaving only the soft hum of climate systems and the faint glow of star maps on the walls. Outside, the twin suns set over crystalline spires, casting long shadows. In that quiet, even the most arrogant delegates had to ask themselves a question they'd never considered before. What if humanity wasn't the junior partner after all? What if they were the ones who'd been holding things together? And what happens now that they've walked away? No one had an answer. But for the first time in centuries, the galaxy felt uncertain, unbalanced, like a song missing its most important note. And somewhere, in the quiet dark between the stars, Earth kept spinning, silent, stubborn, and finally free. The decision to cut ties didn't happen overnight. It wasn't some sudden tantrum or a rash move made in anger. It had been building for years, like pressure in a sealed container, quietly rising until something had to give. And when it finally did, it wasn't just governments or generals who pushed the button. It was ordinary people, tired of feeling like guests in their own future. Back on Earth, the 3 main governing blocs, the African Technate, the Pan-Asian Directorate, and the Americas Coalition, had spent decades arguing over everything: energy policy, water rights, even how to celebrate old national holidays. But this time, something changed. For once, they weren't shouting at each other. They were listening. And what they heard was the same frustration echoing from every corner of the planet. People were done being treated like a resource. It started with small things. Human workers on distant mining colonies were required to sign contracts written in legal code, so dense even trained lawyers struggled to understand them. Families were split apart because the conquered only allowed one parent to accompany a child. Off-world if the child passed genetic compatibility tests. Earth's own inventions, like the biofilters that cleaned toxic air on half a dozen alien worlds, were patented by the Concord and sold back to human settlements at markup prices. Then came the leaks. A young data archivist, working late in a lunar server farm, stumbled on internal Concord reports showing that human labor was listed under cost-efficient organic assets. Not people, assets. Another leak revealed that medical nanobots developed in Nairobi labs were being restricted from use in human colonies unless they included tracking modules approved by Varelian oversight boards. The message was clear: humanity's own creations weren't fully theirs anymore. Videos spread fast. Not flashy propaganda, just raw footage. Workers coughing in methane-rich tunnels on Gliese 667, their suits patched with duct tape because replacement parts were low priority. A mother on Europa begging a conquered official to let her see her son, born with a minor genetic variance that made him non-standard under Alliance rules. These weren't war crimes. They were everyday humiliations repeated across light years until they became unbearable. Public opinion shifted like tectonic plates, slow at first, then all at once. Protests weren't violent. They didn't need to be. People simply stopped cooperating. Dock workers refused to load conquered cargo. Engineers quietly disabled data-sharing protocols on joint research stations. Students in orbital universities began teaching themselves old Earth coding languages instead of the standardized Concord interface. It was a quiet rebellion, built not on anger but on dignity, and the governments noticed. Behind closed doors, leaders who once saw the Concord as humanity's ticket to the stars now saw it as a gilded cage. The benefits, yes, there were some, were outweighed by the cost of losing control over their own people, their own science, their own choices. So when the final vote came, it wasn't a close call. It was unanimous. Not because they wanted isolation, but because they believed humanity couldn't grow while someone else held the leash. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the fallout hit like a shockwave. The Galaxy Council had always assumed Earth would keep playing its part. After all, humans were useful. Their minds were fast, their hands precise, their creativity unmatched. Alien species relied on human-designed systems for everything from climate stabilization on desert worlds to emotional support algorithms for species that struggled with social bonding. No one thought Earth would just stop, but stop they did. Within days, supply chains snapped. A farming world in the Orion Arm ran out of Terran-engineered yeast cultures needed to ferment their staple grain. Without it, their bread turned toxic. A hospital on Qatari Prime lost access to real-time updates for surgical nanites, forcing doctors to revert to manual procedures they hadn't used in 50 years. Even the Concord's own communication network began glitching. Human-written compression code was embedded so deeply in the system that removing it caused data storms across the grid. Panic spread faster than any virus. Smaller member species, the ones who'd always been at the bottom of the Concord's hierarchy, watched in stunned silence. Some felt fear, others felt something new, hope. If Earth could walk away, maybe they could too. Whispers turned into meetings. Quiet complaints became formal petitions. For the first time, the idea that the Concord wasn't eternal began to take root. The council scrambled. Emergency sessions ran around the clock. Delegates argued over whether to impose sanctions, but sanctions on what? Earth wasn't trading anymore. Send peace envoys, all messages bounced back unread, or even consider military options, quickly shut down by cooler heads who remembered how fiercely humans had fought their own wars just a century before. One thing became clear. The Concord had underestimated humanity's role. Not as a military power, but as the quiet backbone of daily life across the stars. Humans weren't just participants. They were the glue. Back on Earth, life didn't stop. It changed. Cities powered down non-essential alien tech and switched to homegrown energy grids. Schools rewrote curriculums to focus on self-reliance, hydroponics, mechanical repair, even old-fashioned radio communication. In orbit, engineers worked in shifts to replace Concord-made components with Earth-built alternatives, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. It wasn't easy. There were shortages, frustrations, moments of doubt. But there was also something else. Pride. People started talking to each other again, not through translated interfaces or filtered avatars, but face to face. Communities shared tools, seeds, knowledge. Old Earth traditions long forgotten in the rush to go interstellar came back. Festivals under real stars, music played on physical instruments, stories told without holograms, and in the silence where alien voices used to be, humanity began to hear itself. The Galaxy Council, meanwhile, was falling apart at the seams. The Varelians, the crystalline species who'd long dominated policy, were accused of arrogance. The methane-breathing Qatari demanded emergency aid for their failing medical systems. A delegation from the insectoid Myrathi, usually silent observers, stood up in the chamber and asked a simple question. If we treated them like equals from the start, would they still be here? No one answered, because deep down, they all knew the truth. Earth hadn't left because they were ungrateful. They'd left because they were finally ready to stand on their own. And the galaxy, for all its wonders and wisdom, hadn't seen it coming. Now, as weeks turned into months, the real test began, not for the conquered, but for humanity. Could they survive without the galaxy's support? Could they rebuild what they'd lost and maybe, just maybe, build something better? No one had a map for that journey, but for the first time in a long time, they were drawing it themselves. The silence wasn't just empty space, it was a shield, and Earth wrapped itself in it like armor. Within weeks of cutting ties, the Sol system vanished from the galaxy's eyes. Not literally, of course. The sun still burned, the planet still turned. But to any ship or scanner from outside, the whole system became a ghost. Signals bounced off invisible barriers. Sensors picked up only static or misleading echoes. It was as if Earth had pulled a curtain around itself, stitched from old defense tech, clever coding, and sheer human stubbornness. They called it the Helios Veil, not a weapon, just a wall. A clear message, we're here, but we're not yours anymore. On the ground, life didn't stop, it transformed. Cities that once buzzed with off-world data streams now hummed with local chatter. Factories that used to assemble parts for alien starships switched to making water purifiers, solar panels, and spare parts for aging Earth-made machinery. In underground labs beneath the Himalayas and the Andes, scientists worked day and night to reverse engineer their own past inventions, because so much of what they'd built over the last century had been handed over, licensed or quietly absorbed into the conquered systems. Mars was hit hardest. The red planet had grown dependent on weekly supply drops from Earth and occasional trade with nearby alien outposts. Now those drops stopped, but instead of panicking, the colonists got to work. Greenhouses that once grew experimental alien flora were replanted with potatoes, wheat, and kale, crops that didn't need special atmospheric tweaks. Engineers jury-rigged old rovers to mine ice from deeper craters. Kids in dome schools learned how to fix oxygen recyclers before they learned algebra. Survival wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Titan, with its methane lakes and thick atmosphere, had always been a scientific outpost. Now it became a fortress of self-reliance. Researchers who once shared data freely with conquered partners locked their findings behind local networks. They started printing tools on 3D printers using recycled ship parts. One team even managed to brew a rough version of coffee using lichen and recycled water. Not great, someone joked in a log entry, but it's ours. Back on Earth, the emotional toll was heavier than anyone expected. Families were split across star systems with no way to reach each other. A parent on Luna might never see their child born on a Proxima colony. Lovers separated by light years could no longer send messages, not even delayed ones. Grief settled in quietly, like fog over a city at dawn, but people found ways to cope. They wrote letters they couldn't send and stored them in digital time capsules. They held memorial gatherings for relationships lost to distance. And in those moments, something unexpected happened. They leaned on each other, not on alien tech or off-world promises, but on the simple, human act of being there. The leadership didn't hide the truth. Broadcasts from Geneva were honest, sometimes painfully so. "This will be hard," one official said plainly. "There will be shortages. There will be mistakes. But every hardship we face now is one we chose because freedom isn't free." That honesty built trust. People didn't expect perfection. They just wanted to know they were in it together. Meanwhile, the Galaxy Council was losing its grip. Their attempts to peek into the Sol system failed again and again. Probes sent toward Earth's orbit were gently disabled, not destroyed, just switched off, and sent drifting back with a repeating signal. Respect our silence. It wasn't hostile. It was firm, and that made it even more unnerving. Some species accused Earth of betrayal. Others whispered that humans had always been unpredictable, too emotional, too chaotic to be trusted in a civilized alliance. But a few, especially the smaller, less powerful members of the conquered, began to wonder if Earth had done something brave instead of foolish. They'd seen how the alliance treated newcomers, how it demanded conformity, how it labeled anything different as non-compliant. Maybe humanity hadn't walked away out of spite. Maybe they'd walked away to protect something the galaxy had forgotten. The right to be messy, to make mistakes, to grow at their own pace. On Earth, that growth was already happening. Without alien oversight, Medical teams revived old techniques that had been banned as inefficient, like physical therapy instead of nanobot injections for certain injuries. Farmers stopped using genetically locked seeds and went back to saving their own, adapting crops to local soil year after year. Artists freed from conquered aesthetic guidelines, painted murals on ruined buildings, composed songs using only acoustic instruments, and told stories that didn't need translation to be understood. It wasn't a return to the past. It was a reconnection with something essential. Even the military shifted focus. Instead of building weapons for interstellar conflict, defense teams worked on protecting supply lines between Earth, Mars, and the Moon. They trained not for war, but for resilience, for keeping lights on during solar storms, for evacuating domes during quakes, for sharing resources when one colony ran short. The new motto wasn't defend at all costs, but care for each other first. And slowly, quietly, a new kind of confidence took root. People stopped looking up at the stars and wondering what the galaxy thought of them. They looked up and wondered what they could build next, with their own hands, their own minds, their own rules. Of course, doubts still crept in. On cold nights, someone would ask, "What if we made a mistake? What if we need them more than we thought?" But the answer usually came from a neighbor, a teacher, a stranger in a food line. Then we'll figure it out, together, because that was the real shift. It wasn't just about cutting ties with aliens. It was about tying back to each other. The Galaxy Council, watching from afar, saw only isolation. But on Earth, people felt something closer to belonging. They weren't alone. They were home. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Months passed. The silence held, and in that quiet, the galaxy began to crack. At first, the Concorde tried to pretend nothing had changed. Official statements called Earth's withdrawal temporary and regrettable but manageable. But behind the polished words, panic was spreading like a slow leak in a spaceship hull, hard to spot at first but deadly if ignored. Trade routes that once hummed with activity now sat empty. Markets that depended on human-made components, tiny sensors, adaptive software, even specialized lubricants for zero-gravity machinery, started to stall. Factories slowed. Hospitals rationed treatments. On some worlds, people didn't even realize how much they relied on Earth until it was gone. Then came the ripple effect. It started with a farming colony near the Orion Fringe. They'd used Terran-designed irrigation algorithms for years, smart systems that adjusted water flow based on soil moisture, weather, even crop growth stages. When the updates stopped, the system froze. Crops withered. The colony sent desperate pleas to the Concorde, but there was no fix. The code was human, and humans weren't talking. That one failure triggered shortages across 3 neighboring systems. Food prices jumped. Tempers flared. That was the moment smaller species began to speak up. For decades, they'd stayed quiet in council meetings, nodding along while the big powers, the Virelians, the Qatari, the Myrithi, made decisions that shaped their lives. But now, watching Earth walk away and survive, they started asking hard questions. Why do we give up control of our own resources? Why must our children be screened by beings who don't understand our biology? If Earth can say no, why can't we? The questions didn't come with threats, just quiet determination. One by one, minor member worlds began demanding renegotiations. Not to leave the conquered yet, but to loosen the rules, to reclaim some autonomy. The Council, already reeling, found itself fighting fires on every front. Unity, once taken for granted, was crumbling. Back on Earth, people watched these shifts not with glee, but with caution. They weren't trying to start a rebellion across the stars. They'd acted for their own reasons, not to inspire others. But they couldn't ignore what was happening. In underground briefing rooms and open-air town halls, debates raged. Are we responsible for this? Did we break something that can't be fixed? Most agreed on one thing: they hadn't broken anything. The cracks were already there. They just stopped pretending they weren't. Life on Earth kept moving forward, not with grand gestures, but with daily acts of rebuilding. In coastal cities, engineers turned old Concorde communication towers into wind turbines. In the Sahara, communities used salvaged heat shields from decommissioned shuttles to build solar cookers. Schools taught kids how to grow food, fix circuits, and read the night sky without digital overlays. It wasn't high-tech. It was practical. And it worked. The psychological shift was just as important. People stopped measuring their worth by how much the galaxy valued them. A farmer in the Amazon basin didn't care if alien food critics praised his tomatoes. He cared that his neighbors had enough to eat. A teacher in Jakarta didn't worry about Concord education rankings. She worried if her students understood how to think for themselves. That return to basics, to purpose over prestige, changed everything. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were blackouts, supply shortages, moments when someone would stare at a broken piece of alien tech and whisper, "We really did this, didn't we?" But those moments were met with action, not despair. Someone would step up. A neighbor would share a spare part. A community would pool resources. The phrase "we'll figure it out" became a kind of quiet anthem. Meanwhile, the Galaxy Council made one last desperate move. They sent a stealth probe. Not armed, not aggressive. Just a small, silent craft meant to drift near the edge of the Sol system and listen. Maybe pick up a stray signal. Maybe catch a glimpse of what Earth was doing. It never got close. Human defense grids, now fully rebuilt with homegrown tech, detected it before it crossed the orbit of Neptune. Instead of destroying it, they sent a gentle electromagnetic pulse, just enough to shut down its systems without damage. Then they nudged it onto a slow return path toward Xylos Prime. Attached to its hull was a simple data chip. No encryption. No hidden code. Just a short message written in plain galactic standard. "We see you. We hear you. But our path is ours alone. Please do not send more." It wasn't rude. It wasn't angry. It was final. That message spread through the Concord like wildfire. Some saw it as proof Earth had become cold, isolationist, even arrogant. But others, especially those who'd always felt like second-class members, saw something else. Clarity. Earth wasn't lashing out. They were setting a boundary. And in a galaxy that had long demanded endless compromise, that kind of clarity felt revolutionary. On Earth, no one celebrated the probe's return. There was no victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement that they'd held the line. Families still missed loved ones across the stars. Scientists still mourned lost collaborations. But they also felt something new, peace. The kind that comes not from winning, but from knowing you did what you believed was right, and then something unexpected happened. In hidden corners of the old data archives, files saved before the comms went dark, human researchers began studying what they'd learned from the Conquered. Not to go back, but to move forward. They looked at alien energy designs, medical models, even art forms, not to copy, but to understand. And slowly, quietly, they started blending those ideas with Earth's own knowledge, creating something entirely new. A fusion not forced by treaties, but chosen freely. The galaxy hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. And humanity, once seen as the youngest, most chaotic member of the Interstellar Club, was now something else entirely. An example. Not of power. Not of technology, but of choice. As the months turned toward a full year of silence, people on Earth looked up at the night sky. Not with longing, but with quiet resolve. The stars were still there. The galaxy still turned. But now, humanity walked its own path beneath them. And for the first time in a long time, that path felt like home. A full year had passed since the silence began. No messages. No signals. No ships crossing the invisible line around the Sol system. To the rest of the galaxy, Earth had become a myth, a story told in hushed tones at diplomatic dinners or used as a warning in policy debates. But on Earth itself, life had settled into a new rhythm, one built not on what was lost but on what remained, each other. The Galaxy Council, after months of failed attempts and growing unrest among its own members, finally did something unexpected. They stopped pushing. In a quiet session broadcast to every member world, the High Arbiter, a being whose voice had once carried the weight of galactic law, spoke plainly. "Humanity has chosen its path," they said. "We cannot force dialogue where none is wanted. From this day forward, the Conquered recognizes Earth's right to self-determination. We will not interfere. We will not intrude. And we ask only that this boundary be respected in return." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a surrender. But it was the closest thing to respect the Council had ever offered, without demanding something in return. Across the stars, the announcement was met with relief, confusion, and in some corners, quiet admiration. The message was clear. The galaxy would move on, with or without Earth. But Earth wasn't waiting for the galaxy to move on. They were already moving forward. In labs buried beneath ancient forests and repurposed subway tunnels, scientists weren't just rebuilding old tech, they were inventing new ways to live. Without access to alien materials, they turned to what the planet offered. Bamboo for lightweight structures, algae for biofuel, even spider silk proteins for medical sutures. Engineers combined old Earth physics with fragments of archived Concord data, not to copy but to question, adapt, and improve. The result wasn't flashy, but it worked, and it was theirs. Schools changed too. Children no longer learned how to interface with galactic networks or speak a dozen alien dialects. Instead, they studied soil chemistry, wind patterns, and how to build radios from scrap metal. They read stories passed down through generations, tales of resilience, of community, of finding light in dark times. History lessons focused less on interstellar politics and more on how humans had survived ice ages, pandemics, and their own worst impulses. The goal wasn't to prepare them for the galaxy. It was to prepare them for life. And life, as it turned out, was full of small wonders. In cities once lit by imported fusion cores, neighborhoods now glowed with solar lanterns strung between rooftops. On Mars, colonists held their first harvest festival using bread baked from homegrown grain. No additives, no alien enzymes, just flour, water, and time. In ocean settlements off the coast of what was once Southeast Asia, divers repaired coral reefs using 3D printed frames made from recycled ship hulls. These weren't grand achievements meant for headlines. They were acts of care, repeated day after day by ordinary people choosing to build rather than break. Of course, the ache of separation never fully went away. There were still moments, standing under a clear night sky watching a comet streak across the black, when someone would wonder what their brother, their friend, their child was doing on a distant moon. But grief had softened into something gentler, memory. People kept photos in physical albums. They planted trees in honor of those they'd lost to distance. They told stories so the next generation would know where they came from. Not just Earth, but the stars they once walked among. Meanwhile, far beyond the Sol system, the galaxy was changing in ways no one predicted. Inspired by Earth's bold step, several smaller species began quietly withdrawing from Concord oversight in key areas: healthcare, education, local governance. They didn't cut ties completely, but they drew their own lines. The Concord, once seen as unshakable, was learning to bend. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Earth hadn't started a war. It had started a quiet revolution of self-respect, and others were listening. Back home, no one called it a victory. There were no parades, no monuments, but there was a feeling, a deep, steady hum of calm that hadn't been felt in generations. People slept easier knowing their choices belonged to them. Farmers planted seeds without needing approval from off-world regulators. Doctors treated patients based on what worked, not what some distant committee deemed standard. Artists painted what moved them, not what would sell in galactic markets. And in that freedom, something beautiful grew: trust. Trust in neighbors, trust in local knowledge, trust that even if the lights went out, someone nearby would share a candle, that if a crop failed, the next town over would send help, that no one would be left behind because they didn't fit someone else's idea of normal. One evening, high in the hills of New Zealand, an old linguist who once spent decades translating alien dialects sat on a wooden bench, looking up at the stars through a simple telescope. No quantum link, no AI enhancement, just glass and metal and human eyes. They didn't try to decode signals or search for ships. They just watched. And for the first time in years, they felt peace. Not because the galaxy was gone, but because Earth was whole again. The stars hadn't changed, but the way humanity saw them had. They weren't destinations to be reached under someone else's rules. They were reminders of how far they'd come, how much they'd endured, and how much they could still become on their own terms. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of birdsong at dawn, of children laughing in courtyards, of wind moving through wheat fields, of hands working together to build something real. Earth hadn't left the galaxy out of fear. It had stepped back to remember itself, and in doing so, it found something the Concord could never give: the quiet certainty that they were enough, just as they were. No grand finale. No final battle. Just people, planet, and the slow, steady work of living with dignity. The galaxy would keep turning. New alliances would form. Old ones would fade. But Earth? Earth was finally home.